Climb to be free. Walk to feel alive. Rediscover happiness in the simple things. Smile. Make yourself at home. Discover the joy of the cold and of vertigo. Listen to the silence. Decipher the language of animals. Walk amidst thousand-year-old forests and the countless forms of life that live there. Travel through the city's underground. Appreciate the view from up high. Then enjoy its unique sights. Look at the horizon and wonder if there is more than meets the eye. Lose yourself in funiculars and labyrinth. Find yourself on a mysterious island. Be amazed by a different culture. Learn about ancient beliefs and traditions. Marvel in their colors and shapes. Wait for the calm of night. And yet, feel that you are never quite alone. Understand that home is wherever we want it to be.
Good morning and good evening. We would like to welcome all of you to our webinar today, ASEAN Role in the Regional Context, Prospects and Challenges. We would like to explain this is a seminar or webinar organized by the Embassy of Chile in Thailand with the collaboration of Universidad Católica de Chile and especially the Center for International Studies of said university. As many of you know, this is the fifth and last webinar of a series of dialogues, Chile-ASEAN Future Perspectives, a rather large project organized by our Embassy of Chile in Indonesia that has kindly invited us to participate. Thank you very much. Today, we would like to start our webinar with three opening remarks. The first one by the Undersecretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile, Mrs. Carolina Valdivia. The second one by the Director of the Center for International Studies of Universidad Católica de Chile, Mr. Jorge Saad. And the third one by our Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of Chile in Thailand, Mr. Fernando Verguño.
Excellency Satvinder Singh, Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN for the Economic Community, distinguished ambassadors, academia, lecturers, dear friends, I am delighted to deliver some remarks in the inauguration of the cycle of dialogues organized by the Chilean embassies to the ASEAN countries in collaboration with the Center for International Studies of the Catholic University of Chile. This activity is a space that aims to open conversations between relevant actors in different areas of both regions to discuss new ways to enhancing Chilean policy towards the Southeast Asia region. For this purpose, the embassies of Chile to Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand will organize webinars on a wide range of topics such as community building, public policies, cooperation, history, regional situations, among others. Chile's relations with the ASEAN countries have increased in recent years. Historically, trade has been the prevailing link. Nevertheless, we seek to explore new spaces to share experiences and establish new networks to enrich this friendship. Considering the historical ties and friendship between our countries, Chile has a special commitment towards ASEAN and aims to foster greater integration. Chile has diplomatic relations with all ASEAN members and 6 resident missions, all with clear and ambitious bilateral agendas. Chile was the first Latin American country to become a formal development partner of ASEAN. This status represents a milestone in Chile's foreign policy towards this region, but also a challenge that invites us to reflect on new perspectives of engagement that open up areas of agenda-setting issues. As you know, ASEAN has 3 pillars: the political security community, the socio-cultural community, and the economic community. And Chile is aware that a comprehensive relationship must address each of these axes. On good governance, we have invited ASEAN member states and the General Secretariat to participate in a course that will address this topic in October this year, to share the experience we have gained in this area. In addition, we expect to present in the coming weeks our cooperation project on financial intelligence analysis, which will allow us to generate further strategic exchange in this area. Given the similar development experiences of Chile and the ASEAN countries, it is possible to develop spaces for cooperation to overcome common problems. For example, with Indonesia, we are working closely on ocean protections and sustainable fisheries. With Malaysia, we are exploring cooperation in areas of innovation. And with the Philippines, we could work on public policy and addressing inequality. Likewise, with Singapore, we are working in green hydrogen and digital economies. With Thailand, we have a capacity-building cooperation program for all ASEAN members. And with Vietnam, we have shared our expertise in superfood cultivation. Of course, there are new challenges that we should face together, such as climate change, a global priority that requires urgent and common action. On this issue, Chile has designed an ambitious agenda to transform its energy matrix, starting with solar energy and hydrogen fuel generation. For this project, we have campaigned with the ASEAN countries for a partnership in this endeavor. I would like to conclude highlighting that this series of online dialogues is the first step of its kind. We hope that the results of these conversations will lead to fruitful ideas for our foreign policy and a better mutual understanding. Thank you all.
Good morning in Asia, in Thailand, and good afternoon here in Chile. My name is Jorge Sad, and I'm the director of the Center for International Studies at the Catholic University, and it's a great honor to co-host this series of dialogues between Asia and Chile from the future perspective of both sides. In this dialogue number 5, we will discuss on Asian role in the regional context, prospects and challenges. This is the final activity of this series of dialogues to exchange or to strengthen the linkages between Chile and Asia. First, I wanted to welcome the Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, Carolina Valdivia, of the Chilean government, the Ambassador Fernando Berguño, the Ambassador of Chile in Thailand, and the speakers, especially Nicole Yen, who will be representing the Center for International Studies and moderating this interesting conversation. For Chile, Asian, it's so important. Actually, our country was the first one in Latin America to become a formal development partner with Asia. We are looking for new engagement perspective that open scopes of issues making the agenda. This series is organized by the embassies of Chile in Asian countries in collaboration with the Center for International Studies at the Catholic University. We aim to open conversation between relevant actors in different fields from both regions. And we hope that after these 5 dialogues, we can move forward to continue strengthening the linkages between Chile and Asia. Thank you very much, speakers, audience, and different authorities from both regions. Good morning, and I hope you have a very insightful conversation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to thank our Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, Carolina Valdivia, for her words, and the Director of the Center of International Studies, Jorge Sad. I should mention I'm not the ambassador, I'm acting charge d'affaires. Our ambassador designate, Alex Geiger, will be with us shortly in a matter of days. I'd like also to thank the Embassy of Indonesia for coordinating this series of conferences, as well as our other embassies in the ASEAN countries for their advice and support. Finally, a word of thanks for the professional help of the CK Helmet team. As an embassy, we are happy to host the 5th chapter of the Chile-ASEAN Future Perspective Dialogue, with a vision from 2 Asian academics of the Chulalongkorn University and University Malaya, and the vision from an associate professor of the Center of International Studies of the Universidad Católica de Chile, whose students are following this webinar and will participate in its debate. To them, a very warm welcome. Our presence in this region is an old one and goes back to the first decades of our country as an independent nation. Our interest in its regional institutions has been constant and ever increasing, as the same institutions have, over the past years, gained experience and widened their scope of action. In June 2019, during the Foreign Ministers' meeting of the 34th ASEAN Summit, Chile was accepted as a development partner by ASEAN. Previously, in 2016, we were accepted as signers of the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation TAC. And in 2015, we asked to join the ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF. Most recently this month, 26th meeting of the ASEAN, Australian and New Zealand Ministers of Economy welcomed Chile's interest to join ANFTA, the ASEAN, Australian and New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, expressing the importance of Chile's presence in ANFTA, which will broaden the EFTA's consumer base of 692 million people to 711.8 million people, and from a combined GDP of 4.65 trillion to US 4.90 trillion. A few words regarding our relations with Thailand. They are close and productive and based on a long friendship. We will be celebrating 60 years of diplomatic relations next year, and Thailand is our main trade partner in ASEAN. We have a recent and successful free trade agreement, and if anything, the COVID pandemic has boosted our cooperation. I should mention a recent agreement this year for accepting electronically signed and sealed certificates of origin in our bilateral trade under the Chile-Thailand Free Trade Agreement. I should also mention a recent seminar between our AXID, our SUBREI from our economic vice subsecretaría, and TICA, the Thai Cooperation Agency, as well as the Mekong Institute. Over the past years in our region, especially in the 3 decades last, we have experienced different or evolving forms of policy coordination and regional integration, with a set of values to serve as their backbone. Today, we will be presented with an examination and an interpretation by 2 distinguished Asian academics of ASEAN's role, its prospects, its challenges in a very real world of 2021 and beyond. And we hope through this exercise to gain an idea through an Asian prism of how a number of issues and challenges are shaping this regional Association, which to us has long ceased to be an unfamiliar block of countries in a faraway and distant region, and has become one of Chile's most prized partners. I believe that this region that has shaped an important part of my diplomatic life, and though it retains much mystery and fascination, is also very much more present in the lives of a new generation of Chileans. What better way to show it than through this seminar and through today's webinar? I leave you with my colleague, Rosario Aranda, for the introduction of our guest speakers. Good day.
Thank you very much, Fernando. We appreciate all the openings remarks given to start this webinar, and we will proceed now to get to know a little bit more about our panelists today and also about our moderator. The first panelist we have today is Professor Naruemon Tapchumpon. She is a doctor and professor from University of Chulalongkorn. Chulalongkorn University is actually one of the universities that we have many activities to and work closely with in Thailand. So we are very happy that she is here today with us. Thank you very much, Professor Naruemon. She is actually also the Deputy Director for Research Affairs of the Institute of Asian Studies at Chulalongkorn University also. And her expertise is in comparative politics and democracy, cross-border migration, human rights, and media freedom. She will be giving an interesting presentation regarding also her latest research about cooperation regarding COVID in the area, in the region, right? That has been sponsored by the Mekong Institute. So thank you so much for being with us today. We have also today Professor Nurliana Kamarudin. She's joining us from Malaysia. She's a professor from University of Malaya, and she's also the Deputy Executive Director of the Asia-Europe Institute at the same university. She specialized in international security and development cooperation, and actually her presentation today will be related and linked to regional security in the ASEAN region. So that will be very interesting. Thank you very much, Professor Nurliana, for being with us today too. And finally, we have our moderator today is Professor Nicole Gene, Dr. Nicole Gene. She's an associate professor at Universidad Católica de Chile, and she's also a researcher at the Center for International Studies at the same university. Her areas of interest are international relations and international security and regional security also, especially the areas of Asia and South America. So we are very happy to have her with us today. And I leave the floor to you, Professor Gene, so you can start with this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning and good evening from Santiago de Chile. I'm very happy and honored to moderate this panel today. I want to thank also in the name of the Center of International Studies from our university to the Chilean Embassy in Thailand for putting together such an excellent panel on a very timely and important topic for the country and the Latin American region, I would say. I don't want to occupy much time. We have two renowned and distinguished academics on ASEAN affairs here who have a lot to tell us. So I would like to ask you, before we start, to please keep with the allotted time, so we will have the chance to engage in a dialogue. And the idea is to have a dialogue session. So the Q&A session, where we can maybe pick up issues from the presentation, but also engage with broader issues, with other issues maybe that won't appear in your presentation. We will start with Professor Naruemon Tapchumpon. Her presentation is on ASEAN's role in the regional context, with a focus on what she calls the current disruptive times that we all know so well, where ASEAN has had to deal not only with the COVID-19 pandemic and all its implications in the economic sphere and else, but also with the political and humanitarian crisis in Myanmar, where the military seized power earlier this year. Without further ado, Professor Narimon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Jane. Good morning and also good afternoon. My presentation will be in the PowerPoint. I will try to be brief so that we will have time for the discussion. Can we start with the PowerPoint, please? Okay, go to the second slide, please. Yes. Yeah, I will be, as Professor Jane comment, I will be more focused on the current, even though I will have a little bit brief on the situation for the position of ASEAN. But I think those who are in the webinar already know more than me and also focus on this, especially Professor Nelina will be add for me. So next slide, please. Yes, I think everyone know about ASEAN, and also I would like to remain again that when we start talking about the issue of ASEAN, this is what we have it in our mind, that we're talking about peace and stability, prosperity, courage and dynamism and purity, which is a flag of ASEAN. But if we can see the situation that now ASEAN is facing is the issue of the economic crisis, issue of the conflict, which is might affect peace and stability, and also the issue of how we are dealing with the prosperity, because the impact of the COVID-19 that hit ASEAN pretty hard. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think the big problem in case of ASEAN when we looking at the situation is that when we try to look at the three pillars of ASEAN, this is the thing that, at least for me who work for the third pillar, actually, I'm not on the peace and security much, even though I'm from the faculty side, but I'm working on the social, cultural, and also economic pillar. So basically, when we see the position and the role of ASEAN, we see from the role of the ASEAN minister meeting, which is we just have recently on the issue of Myanmar. We also have the ASEAN meeting on the economic. And ASEAN itself with the vision of 2025, we just have the midterm review for the third pillar on the security and, on the social and cultural pillar, which is also have a certain impact that we need to link with the social welfare. Next slide, please. For ASEAN, for me, as many people know, and I think for our embassy, especially the Chilean embassy, and also those here, we always remember ASEAN on the economic prosperity. I think since 2015, when the ASEAN Economic Community start, the increasing of the GDP of several countries in ASEAN has increased. We see a lot of the foreign direct investment and also the finance, and especially the mobility of the people that work in several countries within ASEAN. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is an example before the COVID. This is the one that we really dream of, is the map of the economic corridor. If we looking in Thailand, the East-West economic corridor in the middle already, developed. We can go from Da Nang to Mot Lam Yai in Myanmar before Myanmar have the political crisis. And for me, who work on the migration, I already visit several roads. The road from Thailand, from Bangkok to Da Nang, the southern corridor, the road from Map Ta Phut to the west, and also from east to west, from south to north. And we are waiting to see the visiting, the possibility after the COVID to go to the south to visit Indonesia and Singapore. But due to the COVID, I think this ASEAN Highway Road and the idea that we would like to develop for the economic corridor and also the expanding, now we have a certain limitation. Next slide, please. This is an example that we are finding out. On the left side, this is an e-commerce that expanding. Actually, before the COVID, we can see the digital platform has been increased in ASEAN. And among the country in ASEAN, Vietnam, maybe in the rate is very high. Singapore is the first country that already present itself as the digital hub. And with the COVID-19, I would like to announce that the issue of e-commerce had been increasing a lot, more than a lot with the percentage. Right now, Chulalongkorn doing a research on the digital retailing, meaning anything you buy on the platform with the COVID that you cannot go to the street, but you just order, click that, and then you get the Grab buy or whatever to send to you. So we are now in the gig economy. And next year, we are going to see what happened to the banking. And I think the COVID itself is increasing the rate for the digital, economy that increasing in ASEAN. And on the right side, this is a volume of the food trade and also the regional trade in ASEAN. And this is example of coffee, which is, I'm not sure, but this is also famous for Latin America. And see example of the volume of the trade. So right now, in terms of prosperity of ASEAN, even though we face the COVID-19, the trade volume and the digital commerce is also, the e-commerce is very, very progressing, and that we will see how it's going to develop. Next slide, please. But when we go to the pillar on the political and security, I think we ASEAN face the challenge because we are still stick with the non-interference on internal affairs. But even so, what ASEAN do? ASEAN have the link with the national government in terms of the policy. So what ASEAN do in this context? For instance, in Thailand, we have the collaboration on the combating against trafficking, against the organized crime, and I think with the crisis in Myanmar and also surrounding country, the issue of human smuggling and human trafficking, that will be the new issue that the pillar on the political and security may be discussed among ASEAN. Next slide, please. And I think, as you already see in the charter, there are a certain limitation, because I'm going to speak later on Myanmar, that why the political and security pillar have not do much in comparing with another two pillar. Because when we consider as the internal affair, and that's become a crisis, but however, with the situation of COVID, with the situation of the humanitarian crisis within Myanmar, I think the pillar on the political and security affair have started a lot of idea with the special envoy and others. So we need to wait and see how it's developed. It is already been 7 months after the February coup in Myanmar. Next slide, please. This is the one that I'm familiar most, is the pillar on the social and cultural community, because it's a pillar that links between people and people. We have the ASEAN People Forum, we have the Youth Forum. We also have a lot of the connection among the people on the issue. And even though it's called socio-cultural community, but I think in case of ASEAN, we see a lot of the education, the link related to health, and the link that related to the social welfare. Next slide, please. And this is it. The picture is already shown than the words, because the top picture is the issue of the migrant worker. Actually, is in Samut Sakhon in Thailand. In Thailand, we have around 2.8 million migrant workers in Thailand, and basically from neighboring country in ASEAN, from Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So the situation in terms of the social, socio, and cultural community. Right now, the debate right now is on the access, how the ASEAN can get access to, ASEAN people can get access to the resettlement. And I think many countries in ASEAN, very few ratify the Refugee Convention. Some ratify on the right of the migrant worker, but many ASEAN already discussed about the social welfare of the migrant worker, but not yet on the land resettlement or a certain social welfare. So this is the debate that ASEAN may have to discuss. One of the debating right now here is the health access, because in terms of the local health, for instance, Thailand have the National 30 Baht scheme, which is considered universal health care for its own citizen. But for the migrant worker, we have the migrant worker have to go to the MOU and also have to be under the Social Security Fund in order to get access. And I think right now the ASEAN, with its difficult time with the COVID-19, will be the one that I will speak more when we're dealing with the COVID. But the issue of the access to health is also very important. Access to environment, access to personal security, political security, and community security is very important for the when we're dealing with the socio-economic community. Next slide, please. This is the thing that maybe we can see at the region level, that when we talk about role of ASEAN, prospect and challenge, due to the increasing of the economy since 2015, now this is 6 years after 2015, we see a certain country that benefit for the economic community, but we also see a certain widening gap of inequality among the ASEAN country. And I think this is the situation that we need to discuss. And the issue of risk and epidemic across border is also the situation that we are facing right now. For instance, the Delta in Thailand is now very serious, but the Delta is cross border from the south, from Malaysia, and I think from Malaysia may also get it from another country. So the cross-border health is also have a certain impact. And since it's linked with the access to local health, and that will be the issue at the region that we may work together how to dealing with the cross-border on the issue of health risk, and also the issue of how to dealing with the situation. We also have the issue of transboundary natural resources in ASEAN with the Mekong, Salawin, Mekong River Basin, Salawin River Basin, and also other river basin that's considered transboundary. And since they also have a few mechanisms with dealing with the transboundary resources management. So I think this is a debating maybe the role of ASEAN, the ASEAN, the international intergovernmental on the human rights, maybe when it's dealing with the economic rights and social rights that affect all the natural resources that maybe need to discuss. The other one is human trafficking, which is I already mentioned, and the last one is the cross-border tension. We see due to the COVID, we see the all countries seal their border, but also within country, the tension as a situation of tension at the border or cross border is affect. not because of the political conflicts, but sometimes it's related to the economic, into the health, and also the access to welfare. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to the one that the moderator talking on the current issue, which is the Myanmar crisis. It's very current. It's already been 7 months. ASEAN have a 5 consensus. It's a consensus, but not yet practices. I don't know. I may use this forum to ask ASEAN as well that what happened to my ASEAN special envoy on Myanmar, because ASEAN has a summit on the situation of Myanmar. But if we see the situation right now, it's already been escalating. Those who face the military government is not yet able to, consolidate the power. On the other hand, those who come from the election already formed the National Unity Government, the NUG, and now we see with the new word PDF, which is not our PDF file, but People Defense Force. And now you see a lot of armed conflict, or at least conflict at the situation within Myanmar. So that's quite a crisis now. And with the issue of humanitarian on the Myanmar crisis, Myanmar right now face the COVID-19 similar to other countries, but with the nearly going to be considered as a failed state, and the access to health is very difficult. Many people already estimate that the number of those infected by the COVID-19 in Myanmar might be reached maybe 50,000 a day, which is maybe too exaggerate, but at least more than 10,000 or 20,000 is quite accurate. So I think this is quite serious. And with no access to health, or incompetent in terms of the situation and the armed conflict within Myanmar, I think Myanmar will be a huge, huge problem for ASEAN. And we cannot just leave one country alone, because it will ASEAN prosperity to be go down the drain as well. So this is a more challenge than the prosperity, but I think this is a thing to discuss among ASEAN. My two last PowerPoint is on the COVID-19. Next slide, please, on the COVID-19. The COVID-19, can I ask for move the slide? The COVID-19 is very serious in ASEAN. But in Thailand, it's quite serious when it's dealing with our migrant worker. As I told you, we have 2.9 million migrant worker in Thailand, and mostly around 2 million from our neighboring in ASEAN. And in this context, number of the COVID-19 right now is quite serious. And even though Thailand and I think other countries already start talking about vaccine for all citizens, but the number to the vaccine to our migrant worker is still in the discussion. In Thailand, only those who come under Social Security Fund, meaning MOU, migrant worker, or the migrant worker that their employer already put to the Social Security Fund. For these people, they will get vaccine, they will get access to health. Right now, the Thai government already start talking about vaccine to all, not only the Thai citizen, but to all the migrant worker. But I think in ASEAN, we also need to discuss, we borrow some vaccine from our neighboring country in ASEAN in order to vaccine our citizens. But I think ASEAN may also need to discuss how to dealing with the COVID-19, how to help boost the economy back, or how to dealing with the issue of cross-border health that it also affects for all ASEAN. And I think this is quite a serious on the COVID-19. In Thailand, when this is from my research, Chulalongkorn have 3 research on the COVID-19 among our worker, and also we also start doing the impact of the COVID-19 in country in ASEAN. We also found out that the most important part, and I think since I'm glad that three of us are women, women is the most vulnerable. We are the one who the first to be laid off. We are the one who have to dealing with unpaid reproductive health when those who unemployed go back to stay at home. We are facing the no social distancing because everybody at home. And with the study online with your kids, now it's become quite a difficult time for our women. And then the second group is the elderly. I'm not sure whether the elder men or women, but in case these elder, they are the highest rate for casualty. I mean, those who die because of the COVID-19, maybe not about the virus, but the impact from the virus that destroy the lung. This is also the highest rate that we also finding is happening in ASEAN. So for me, my last slide will be, what should we do in order to dealing with this situation? First, I would like to propose the word with 3R: redefine, re-examination, and also re-evaluation. What the word with redefinition? I think ASEAN have a beautiful motto about caring community. So this time you have to be concretely redefine. What do you mean by the word caring? Caring our own house first and then other later, or caring with the wording as long as we are safe. And I think now the caring community have to be matched up with the debate between non-interference and constructive engagement. So if we are really want to be a real caring community, I think first we need to be redefinition. The second one is examination. I mean, we have a lot of initiative, but what happened to practice? I think ASEAN need to change its practices, especially for all some in ASEAN, and also a lot of new initiative that we have to dealing with a lot of the challenge at the current situation. In Thailand, we expect that economic will come back in 2024, which is 3 years from now. So I think if we want to make it faster, maybe next year or the year after next year, we need to be really re-examining our own practice. And last one, we might need to be re-evaluation that what we have done from 2020 before we arrive 2025. I think this is a real good time for ASEAN to re-evaluate our own initiative, our own dialogue, our own practices, and in order to meet prosperity, because for me, I see the challenge ahead than the prosperity. And my last point is that don't forget people in ASEAN. When we talk about ASEAN, it's not only the leader, it's not only the summit, it's not only the meeting among ministers and also ministerial meeting. I think the role of the ASEAN people will be very important for ASEAN community to be able to meet their prospect and also to overcome its challenge. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Narimon, for this succinct overview over ASEAN as a regional actor. I thought it was revealing that you chose a perspective on human security instead of a more traditional understanding of security that has long been very much focused on the state, right? And you were very clear in your final reflections, looking at the way ahead, what should ASEAN do in the future? Basically, you said ASEAN should look for its people, provide public goods, and don't keep it only with the usual picture of ASEAN leaders holding hands. And you had one nice picture where I think the leaders were just about to get ready for the picture, but still the hands, the chain hasn't been closed yet. So one could also think of this as emblematic, as illustrative of ASEAN in these disruptive and difficult times, having a difficult time to close hands and stand together. Revealing also how Professor Nariman began talking about Myanmar, I think. She had a big smile on her face and said, well, ASEAN's role, I am not sure. But we will amplify our views on ASEAN's role in the political and security context in the region in our next presentation by Professor Nurliama Kamaluddin. For the next 20 minutes, she will tell us about ASEAN as a security community. She will surely explain to us what that means, a regional security community. And she'll also talk about how the security community goes about problems such as conflict in the South China Sea, for example. Without further ado, Professor Nurliama, the floor is yours.
Good morning. If I could have my slides, please. First of all, thank you, Professor Nicole, but I'm not a professor yet. So just Nurliama is fine. As pointed out, I'll be talking today about ASEAN's approach to regional security. And I thank you, Professor Nariman, for your wonderful contribution today, especially on the contemporary issues of ASEAN security, which I thought I could complement by looking really at how we understand security in ASEAN and why ASEAN moves or approaches security the way it does by taking a little bit more of a historical context and then discussing the current mechanisms that ASEAN has. My next slide, please. So basically, this concept of a security community that ASEAN faces or ASEAN aspires itself to be is very different than what other people, or at least very different than what the formalized security alliances is, right? It's really more this sense of trying to look at a region through peaceful change, where we have joint interests and agreed upon mechanisms in order to reduce suspicion and tension, rather than focusing or working on formalized military alliances and having strategic partnerships which requires participation through punitive measures. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of international watchers sometimes forget or expect ASEAN to do more than what ASEAN itself has set itself up to do. Next slide, please. So essentially, a security community really goes through several different evolutions to achieve better institutionalization, right? So you have this idea of a nascent security community where a group of countries could have shared threat perceptions. They have benefits which they feel are mutual among all the member countries. They have an identity which they feel could then lead to the emulation of an organization. And then as they progress through that and become a more ascending type of security community, they might have tighter military coordination, and that kind of cooperation and trust between member countries essentially tends to have this transition where your processes and identities can then be translated into more formal agreements, and fear can thus be lessened among member countries for fear of conflict between member countries. And then finally, when communities or a regional organization has matured into a better security community, then you can always expect this kind of group to have greater institutionalization, of course, higher degree of trust, and almost no probability of conflict, which, some people would argue organizations such as the EU has achieved this kind of evolution, but ASEAN really is very much still within a nascent or ascending phase. So of course, though, this idea of this evolution, when we talk about security community, is not a linear phase. And all regional organizations go through processes that could put them either, at nascent, ascending, or between ascending and mature, neither really fitting here nor there. And ASEAN is the same. So the process that ASEAN has gone through is also not linear. There has been issues where, the aspect or the expectations of what ASEAN needs to do has been higher than where they are actually at as a regional organization. Next slide, please. So looking at Southeast Asia itself and perhaps understanding the concept of where ASEAN comes from would also give us a good idea about why perhaps ASEAN itself has not been able to achieve that level of cooperation. Because this concept of Southeast Asia itself is a post-colonial concept. Today, we accept it and embrace it as that regional grouping of our own. But honestly speaking, the countries of Southeast Asia, because of the fact that we are both continental Southeast Asia and then a grouping of island nations that cuts across different parts of the land, right? And it is also geographically interesting position where we've been situated on a global maritime trading route. And over the years and centuries, Southeast Asian countries have had various spheres of historical influence, really building upon that identity, which creates a variety within these member states. So this concept of Southeast Asia as a grouping has not had perhaps the same kind of length in terms of like the European experience of a Judeo-Christian history and culture, bringing it together. So this is what we build upon today in our modern understanding of ASEAN member countries. Next slide, please. So if you see Southeast Asia, the modern nation states that make up our member nations didn't come around until the 1950s. Before that, we have always been traditional kingdoms with very porous borders, situated or built upon royalty and power representation. So this national boundary and national idea of nation building and integration is very new. So we have not had a natural origin of democratic representation, and all of this was introduced and is a byproduct or reaction to Western colonial powers. So for the longest time, many of Southeast Asian countries were all colonial, were all under colonial expansion, right? So the Dutch were here, the Portuguese were here, the English, of course, for a long time. So that kind of conflict building, that kind of conflict really resulted in a very different type of nation building throughout ASEAN. Next slide, please. What we also need to understand is the context that ASEAN as a regional organization emerged out of, right? So after countries went through the nation building, went through independence and became modern state as we know and understand them today, they were immediately thrust upon a time period where it was about power conflict, right? So there was a huge debate as well as fear about this conflict between democracy and communism. And there was a huge fear towards US's abandonment as well for countries that were non-communist. There was fear about Russia's imperialistic ambition or USSR's imperialistic ambition at that time. There were many leaders who were just coming out of war, and there was this very, very strong dichotomy about what was seen or supposed to be a very universalist aspect and approach towards the sphere of influence between the USSR and the USA. And ASEAN member countries as new nations at that time were caught in a situation where they always fear for their survival before they could actually plot or plan towards moving ahead as modern nation states. So can I have the next slide? So what you see was that the effort to form any kind of regional organization in ASEAN at that time was very much covered or very much shaped by that experience. So one of the first ones was SEATO, right? The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which really was supposed to be reliant on outside power and had very little cooperation from Southeast Asian member countries itself, except Thailand and Philippines signed on to it, but almost all the other member countries were not interested. And then we had the first effort of the Association of Southeast Asia, which was also marred by conflict in the region, like for example, Malaysia and Sabah's dispute about Malaysia and Philippines dispute about Sabah. There was also a lack of representation at that time. Indonesia did not join, and there was also a lack of interest from Western countries in trying to support this effort to build a regional organization due to the fact that there was a proposal for SEATO. So next slide, please. So the reason why SEATO did not really take off, because it was envisioned to be this larger anti-communist alliance that was supposed to fit into all the other treaty organizations at that time. And it was also supposed to situate the US military within the Southeast Asia. And as I've pointed out just now, Southeast Asian countries were coming out of colonialism. And there's this huge fear of losing their ability to govern for themselves and for them to be able to move away from the influence of larger Western powers. Next slide, please. So it was really the Association of Southeast Asia that, that started local building when it comes to trying to shift the prospect of security being something that ASEAN member countries, or at least at that time Southeast Asian member countries themselves, had to take charge of, right? Of course, like I pointed out, that this was complicated by other issues. But the focus was that they wanted to try and build a security that was based on military neutrality. And from that, really, what was implicit was to withstand political subversion, but also in the explicit manner to bank on other aspects that would then hopefully spill over into creating more prosperity and peace within the region, which is economic cooperation and social cooperation. Next slide, please. So that really is what led to the formation of ASEAN, right? So the need to form a regional entity in order to enhance regional relations and cooperation between these newly independent nations. So the ASEAN Declaration was signed by the 5 foreign ministers of the original member countries, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. Next slide, please. And these are then where we have continued to expand or to work on trying to include the rest of Southeast Asia within ASEAN, for that ASEAN becomes then the basis for all interactions and representations of Southeast Asia. So of course, we've expanded throughout the 1980s and 1990s to include Brunei, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, and currently we have Timor-Leste, which has been an observer state since 2002 and has also officially applied for membership in 2011. Next slide, please. So essentially what makes the ASEAN 5, or at least the security outlook of the ASEAN 5 really at that time, wasn't an explicit mention of political alliance and defense, but rather it was built upon the suspicion of external interference from the initial 5 ASEAN members. And it was really very much something that was executed at a political elite level, because it was the ministers who would meet, the foreign ministers, who drove much of the bargaining and the agreements between the ASEAN 5 members. So it was intended to try and control conflict through managing a situation or a region that was just facing political vacuum from having colonial powers leaving, and then now having these small member nations that were still distrustful of one another, trying to do so in a manner that would not allow or leave them vulnerable if you rely on military confrontation rather than diplomatic discussions, right? And ASEAN's formation in the 1960s didn't actually formalize until the first summit in the 1970s. So overall, ASEAN has always taken a very slow progress towards actual regional integration. Next slide, please. So you can see what the ASEAN Declaration is like. Implicitly, there is still a huge focus on ensuring peace and prosperity within the region. But this is done in a manner where the conditions are about mutual interest. The condition is about the idea of self-responsibility in mitigating conflict between ASEAN member states. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So overall, this is how we understand or how we should approach ASEAN as a security community. It is not a formalized military alliance. It is not a formalized security alliance, but rather an organization that is built on like-mindedness or similarities. It looks more at conflicts avoidance and peaceful resolution of dispute, as opposed to actual interactive or actual hard power influence in other countries, right? And it has always had a very constructivist approach, even on its own building of a community that is done through socializations, norms and identities, as opposed to actual rules and regulations or a hosting of a parliament that requires member countries to give up sovereignty. So if you look at the next slide, thank you. what we see today is that much of ASEAN's effort in order to ensure regional security is done through two phases. One is what we know as the ASEAN way, right? So decision-making processes in ASEAN is always done through consultation and consensus. And that requirement has to also consider that there needs to be a refrain from the use of force and peaceful settlement of disputes. And all of this comes about because of the fact that ASEAN members have been trying to prevent regional conflict and war via avoiding military confrontations, right? And it is very much a power of, a product of rejection of that initial multilateral defense cooperation, as well as staying out of military confrontations of, like, for example, the US, Vietnam, or Indochina campaign. Next slide, please. So the ASEAN way really was a focus of enhancing the bargaining power of the small states, right? So the regional autonomy is based upon trying to find regional solutions for regional problems in a manner that would allow smaller states to band together to do or to decide what they wanted to do themselves during a time where two major hegemons were head-to-head, right, which we were talking about in terms of the Cold War. So that's why ASEAN focused on trying to build a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. And they've also always spent that time trying to mitigate great power rivalry in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. Another aspect that ASEAN really has focused on is trying to ensure ASEAN centrality. So when ASEAN member countries engage in the larger platform of international relations, this participation is done through multilateral participation of ASEAN. So the engagement of ASEAN is that ASEAN needs to be the central driving agency in how it deals or how it presents itself to the rest of the world, be it in the UN, be it within the larger East Asian Summit, be it in ASEM, which is the ASEAN Asia-Europe meeting. So ASEAN itself holds the driving seat in terms of agenda making. Next slide, please. But overall, what you see today is that ASEAN itself has become a political security community. I think Professor Narma has already spent a good time talking about this. So what I'll focus on really is the ASEAN security mechanisms. ASEAN relies on forums and diplomatic means as the measure of how it focuses on conflict solutions, right? The ASEAN Regional Forum and the ASEAN's Defense Minister meeting. Next slide, please. So the ASEAN Regional Forum, again, is a mechanism for dialogue. It's supposed to allow ASEAN as the larger role for convening power, and it was shaped to be the opposite of the US military alliance effort in East Asia, right? So the US practices a hub and spoke structure where the US becomes the primary security provider, and then it has different spokes of those, whether it is with its alliance with South Korea or its alliance with Japan and so on and so forth. But ASEAN does not want that, and we believe that there is a need for dialogue and consensus better, which might be slow, but generally in line with how, or it gives more right for all member countries to talk, right? So there is always assistance on the inclusion of countries, even like China and North Korea, which are probably the only regional forum that allows for these countries to be a member of. Next slide, please. So activities under the ARF, they have 5 different work streams, and this is also the same as where Professor Narma has pointed out. Really, ASEAN's focus on security is moving away from your traditional military security power and looking at areas where cooperation is more likely as opposed to confrontation. Next slide, please. So this, of course, I think is always the problem. ASEAN's centrality and ASEAN way is constrained by consensus, right? So this confidence building and preventative diplomacy, as well as elaborations of approach to conflicts, then becomes constrained because ASEAN is always stuck on, stage 1 and stage 2. So it's also been unable then to, address other important regional conflicts such as the South China Sea, North Korea, and even Myanmar. But at the same time, ASEAN has done quite well in providing opportunities for us to de-escalate crisis and has always been able to take measures or good responsive measures to things like terrorism and maritime security, as well as humanitarian relief or disaster relief, where ASEAN has done very well in terms of its cooperation. Next slide. So ASEAN's defense minister meeting is also another platform where this is done. I don't need to go too much into this. I'll just quickly finish up my speech. Next slide. And the next one. Next. Thank you. Right. So in terms of the final issue really is how does ASEAN approach contemporary security issues, right? There's a few things that ASEAN really is facing today that becomes the larger concern. One is the South China Sea, where you have overlapping claims as well as China's military presence. And this is what ASEAN sees as separate from the Sino-US rivalry as well. I think a lot of the times the Western or the Northern Hemisphere tends to conflate these two things together, when in truth, South China Sea is something that ASEAN sees as a personal or a local conflict, which requires a local regional solution in conversation with China. So there's the code of conduct discussion, which continues to be discussed, right? The declaration of code of conduct. While else the Sino-US rivalry is creating a whole different aspect of that security level, where you have the issue of the Indo-Pacific, or the issue currently of the AUKUS, where you have the Australia, UK, and US security alliance, which has created a big fear about the nuclearization of Southeast Asia with Australia's effort to acquire nuclear submarine. So to ASEAN, these are two different things because of the fact that now you are putting the small organization again as a center of conflict, which doesn't actually concern the members, right? So it's not something that ASEAN member countries themselves are participating in the conflict, but we become the battleground. And then, of course, finally, we have the Myanmar crisis, which has actually two layers to it. One itself is the Rohingya refugee crisis, and you've had very differentiating response from ASEAN member countries. For example, Malaysia and Indonesia tend to be a lot more sympathetic to the refugee crisis as opposed to other countries. But you also have the question of what is ASEAN's role within what is seen as an eternal conflict in Myanmar. There is a conundrum on whether we address the current power, which is the Tatmadaw, the junta, or do we address or do we acknowledge the national unity government? So ASEAN has always found itself caught in these manner of conundrums and has always relied really on the progress or the idea that diplomatic means of solution is the way forward. So this is where I'll end, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nuliana. That was a very interesting presentation demonstrating, amongst others, how Southeast Asia's history of colonialism and its experience during the Cold War have determined, to quite a big extent, the institutional design and functioning of ASEAN. In Chile, by the way, you are professora, once you teach, so we are fine on that. I would like to start the Q&A session. If I'm looking around a bit strange, that is because I have different windows open here, trying to see all the questions that come in. I suggest, for the benefit of time, that we take 3 at once, and maybe we can do 2 rounds. And I would leave it, unless there's a question addressed to one of you, I want to leave it open who wants to answer. If you both want to answer, you are invited to do so. So the first question is by Ambassador Ayares, who is in Jakarta. He asks, which possible areas of cooperation between Chile and ASEAN do you see besides the economic area? Then there's a question on the recent AUKUS agreement, the deal that Australia, the UK, and the US agreed. How do you think the recent AUKUS agreement will shape the security context in ASEAN? Is the concept of ASEAN centrality being challenged? And then there is one on the Indo-Pacific. That is, do you think that the Indo-Pacific concept, I guess in contrast to the Asia-Pacific or other ideas of region, provides for a better framework or basis for regional institutions to develop and to provide stability? I know these are quite big questions and each of them could take a whole morning, but I invite you to answer what you feel like and to the extent you wish at this point.
I will take the one that related to economy and non-economy. I mean, non-politics, not exactly non-politics, non-military. So I give that kind of submarine in Australia, UK, US with Nalina that you will answer. So I will do something small. Like I think for the collaboration between Chile and ASEAN, I think at the moment we see a lot of bilateral. For instance, Taika in Thailand have quite a good relationship with the Chile. I mean, in terms of collaboration and cooperation. I think that maybe this is, let me repeat again, because we do what you call consensus. And we try to find everything for consensus and the cooperation. So the collaboration between Chile will be more with member states of ASEAN rather than at the regional organization, but more with each country. However, I would like to propose that the ASEAN humanitarian assistance, the AHA, with the word quite exaggerate word AHA, the AHA, the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center, maybe will be the one that we might that we should explore, because the ASEAN humanitarian assistance start after the cyclone Nagis, and also start dealing with the issue of forest fire, and also his in Indonesia and in Myanmar and other. So maybe the link with ASEAN we can discuss on this topic, whether the collaboration on a certain humanitarian support can do or not, and that can be do. But because it will go from, one country bilateral among two, country to be for one and with the region. The second thing, maybe Professor Jane and yourself who are doing with the ASEAN and Latin America can propose, because I think the ASEAN itself have like the ACWC, the committee that work on women and children, and also the committee that work on human rights. There are two specific committee. But under this intergovernmental organization, even though the funding comes from each member state, but that can be talk about collaboration. So maybe the collaboration on the, so-called non-political, such as education or cultural exchange, and also any other can be proposed. And I think since the COVID-19 is easier for us to meet to online, because we don't need to travel. One thing is difficult that you cannot meet in person, but on the other way, that it may be easier to do a certain discussion and support. So that may be one kind of the collaboration. So I would like to sum up that beside the economic era, the link on the issue of the, education, or even the issue of debating about how to support, the digital information or transformation that link among other. And the last thing, I think, due to right now the world is easier to travel, so the debate about human trafficking or human smuggling we can possibly discuss as well. So I think this is my proposal. And I think Taika would like to do something more, I guess.
Thank you very much. I am sure that Ambassador Ayades is there taking notes gratefully. Nuriana, do you want to take the question on AUKUS?
Yeah, I can.
On submarines.
I can attempt to answer the question, because if I had an answer, like I should probably, go to ASEAN and give them suggestions on how to address this. But honestly, really, what do I think about the recent AUKUS agreement, and will it shape security context in ASEAN? I believe it will impact, definitely. There's a reason why ASEAN countries or ASEAN member countries have been very upset. I mean, to use a nice smaller word for this, about the agreement, the security alliance. Although Australia has made the statement that this is not supposed to impact, it's not meant to be impacting on ASEAN's own security efforts, and it's not meant to increase or to change the region into a nuclear territory. But there's very real concern for ASEAN leaders that there is a possibility that you start an arms race once you have another country in the region that is enhancing its military to the level of being nuclear, to the level of having nuclear capabilities. Even if Australia itself does not plan to develop nuclear weaponry or have its own local nuclear weapons development program. So as a whole, my answer is that, one, yes, it will definitely impact the security context of ASEAN, and two, will it impact ASEAN centrality as well? I think that yes, to some level, it would also create an impact. So the question really is, where do we go from here? Or we'll have to see how it progresses on the engagement that Australia will choose to have with ASEAN in the future, because Australia is part of the ADMM Plus, so it is one of the strategic dialogue partners. It's also part of the ASEAN Regional Forum. So Australia has been a very active player within the ASEAN's, within the ASEAN's platform and mechanism dialogues as well. So inherently, do I see us heading towards, future possible conflicts? I would like to say, I would like to be positive at least about this, and I think overall we are always in the hopes that we will focus more on that diplomatic diplomacy when it comes to conflict prevention. But at the same time, it also would be naive to say that AUKUS is not going to change or not going to impact ASEAN's own effort for strategic security or discussions in the future. What was the second question, I think, on Indo-Pacific?
It was about the Indo-Pacific, whether that concept provides for a better framework for regional organizations to move on or to provide public goods.
Right. So you see, this is also another interesting aspect to discuss, because when you say Indo-Pacific, it really is like everything and nothing in between. Because because before this we've had Asia-Pacific. So India is part of Asia already. So it was already a term or an umbrella term which covered the whole Indian Ocean all the way up to Japan, right? The Pacific Ocean. So I guess it really hasn't been much but a change of terms and a realigning of security partnerships to include what we know as the Quad, right? So US has this rivalry going on with China, which sadly or unfortunately ASEAN is caught in the middle. And one of the biggest concerns that ASEAN member countries has always had is the pressure to choose, if I'm using this with air quotes, to choose between its alliance between China or the United States, which really is unfair either way, because Southeast Asia are neighbors to China, and we've had longer historical connections with China as well. But Southeast Asia is also very well aware of big powers offering salvation without actually ever really delivering on them. So the idea is the matter is that ASEAN has already made a statement on Indo-Pacific. We have no problem in accepting the term and working within this framework of what the Indo-Pacific is meant to be. But to ASEAN member countries, I don't think it actually changes the mechanisms that ASEAN has always engaged in. ASEAN's own statement on Indo-Pacific actually still insists on the inclusion of China using established framework, which is, dialogue frameworks in order to engage with whatever strategic movement that we would have moving forward. So overall, would it be a better? I can't answer if it would be better or worse, but I also don't think that it would enhance or it would significantly change the way ASEAN engages in terms of its international security choices.
I am aware of the time, but we started a bit late, so I hope we can do a second, but a short round of questions. There is one regarding the US-China rivalry. That is whether, and I would like to add a small question to that one because it is very much related. Does the US-China rivalry put stress on ASEAN because it divides the organization and puts pressure on it to deliver? To what extent is the ASEAN way under stress? Do you think we will see a change in how ASEAN functions? And the question that I would like to add to that one is a question that I've been asking a lot of people. A few months ago, Singaporean veteran diplomat Bilahari Kausikan suggested that Cambodia, if it actually hosts or will host in the future, a Chinese military base might have to be kicked out of ASEAN or will have to think about leaving ASEAN. Not sure whether you saw this. Cambodia reacted very strongly. And well, the issue, I think, faded from the agenda, but I would like to hear your views. Do you think it's a real possibility that an ASEAN member will leave, that the membership of the organization will shrink?
Okay, may I answer, but not exactly full answer your question, but I can complain as a people that because of the rivalry, at least look at the vaccine. If you have the China vaccine, Sinovac, Sinopharm, you can travel to a certain country. If you have only Pfizer, Moderna, you can travel a certain country as well. So for us, as those who are in the middle, it means that how many vaccines I have to jab in order to travel. And I think this is quite abuse my right to movement because of your rivalry. This is affected the people, and I think this is quite, I don't know, this is a very debating that, from the context. Another thing, I think the rivalry is not only, security or the debate about military security, but look at the trade rivalry. Right now, if we buy a certain mobile phone, you have to check whether this mobile phone come from which country or to another country. In that context, you cannot use a certain program. And I think this is example, but in that context is limited the what you call innovation. Because we are in the digital, you should support people to be more innovative and creative. But because of the what you call the concept of the state-centric approach, and I would like to repeat that this is not even the regional approach, it's the state-centric approach between a two superpower country, and that's limited ASEAN. And I think that's why put ASEAN in a very difficult position, because you can, and in that context, maybe the word that non-interference or consensus, no binding without agreement, going through dialogue other than force that allow ASEAN to have room, to discuss. But because it will be difficult to, create the second Cold War period, I think it's impossible to create the idea of rivalry with the camp as a Cold War. I think is already obsolete, in my opinion, looking at the challenge that we are facing. So for me, maybe ASEAN might be find some way to propose. I don't know how to propose, but look at the country that we cannot move our country outside our, geographical territory. So for me, it may not shrink ASEAN, but it may force ASEAN, to do a certain kind of the dialogue or discussion. It might be more than one level of dialogue or more than one layer. But I think we might see it from the meeting of ASEAN in, December or in coming times. Thank you.
Thank you, Nurliana.
I think Professor Narma put it very perfectly. It's the fact that ASEAN really is caught in the middle. In Malaysia, we have a saying, when elephants fight, it's the mouse deer in the middle that dies. And that's really what ASEAN is going through right now, due to the fact that rivalry between China and the US really isn't just about a military concern, right? It's not really just a concern about military bases that are here in the Philippines or whether Cambodia will host a Chinese military base. The concern is larger in the sense that it impacts us in terms of our trade, in terms of our livelihood. It also concerns in the fact that ASEAN then becomes forced to choose even in issues of public health, where we have countries in ASEAN which cannot afford to buy vaccines, for example, and are now being forced into a situation where they need to pander to one or the other of the larger powers. So essentially, really, it does impact ASEAN in a variety of sectors, and whether or not ASEAN as an organization will be able to make one unified choice, that's definitely not going to happen, because relationships between member countries to these two different powers are different. But secondly, will it impact ASEAN as an organization, and is there a possibility of losing member? Actually, this is my opinion, but I don't think so, because ASEAN has always been flexible in the manner of how it allows member countries to buy into decisions. So ASEAN has a consensus-based decision-making, meaning if you are not of the consensus to what ASEAN as a regional organization has decided, you have an option to opt out of that decision, right? And then perhaps come back or visit it later in the future. So ASEAN has always had this. We've always been at odds with one another with various different kinds of approaches. But the good thing about ASEAN's manner of engagement is that it allows for that disagreement. Of course, it makes ASEAN slow in its decision-making, but it also makes ASEAN flexible, and ASEAN has always moved towards greater engagement rather than backwards. Slow, very slow, but we've always had progress. And I think that is a positive factor that a lot of people tend to forget about ASEAN.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the time, and I think at this point I have to close this panel discussion. Thank you very much, Narimon and Nurliana, for your excellent presentations and for answering real big questions in a very precise and clear manner. I think there's lots of food for thought, really, that you have given for the Latin American side of this dialogue series. There are, on one hand, many differences when it comes to regional cooperation between the two regions. Southeast Asia is really in the center of great power rivalry at the moment, and Latin America is almost forgotten at the periphery of great power interest. And there are other differences, but at the same time, I do believe that there are some commonalities. I always remember Argentina's Cristina Fernandez Kirchner saying about Mercosur. We have a mode of functioning that is, we talk and we dialogue and we try to find consensus. We're not like the Europeans. So that is something that sounds very much like the ASEAN way, right? I thank you again for participating, also to everyone who connected at this time. I also know in Thailand it's a national holiday. And with this, I hand the floor back to Rosario.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jene. Thank you, Dr. Nurliana and Dr. Naruemon, for these interesting presentations and very interesting discussion. Thank you for answering the questions too. We are really pleased that you were able to be with us today. So with this, we are closing our webinar on ASEAN role in the regional context, prospects and challenges. Thank you, everybody, for attending today, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Happy.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Walk to feel alive. Rediscover happiness in the simple things. Smile. Make yourself at home. Discover the joy of the cold and of vertigo. Listen to the silence. Decipher the language of animals. Walk amidst thousand-year-old forests and the countless forms of life that live there. Travel through the city's underground. Appreciate the view from up high. Then enjoy its unique sights. Look at the horizon and wonder if there is more than meets the eye. Lose yourself in funiculars and labyrinth. Find yourself on a mysterious island. Be amazed by a different culture. Learn about ancient beliefs and traditions. Marvel in their colors and shapes. Wait for the calm of night. And yet, feel that you are never quite alone. Understand that home is wherever we want it to be. Climb to be free. Walk to feel alive. Rediscover happiness in the simple things. Smile. Make yourself at home. Discover the joy of the cold and of vertigo. Listen to the silence. Decipher the language of animals. Walk amidst thousand-year-old forests and the countless forms of life that live there. Travel through the city's underground. Appreciate the view from up high. Then enjoy its unique sights. Look at the horizon and wonder if there is more than meets the eye. Lose yourself in funiculars and labyrinth. Find yourself on a mysterious island. Be amazed by a different culture. Learn about ancient beliefs and traditions. Marvel in their colors and shapes. Wait for the calm of night. And yet, feel that you are never quite alone. Understand that home is wherever we want it to be.